A long and exhausting day in Gaza is finally coming to an end. Inside a small tent near a hospital, 6 journalists sit together. They're exhausted, hungry. Some haven't eaten properly in days. A few struggle to stay awake. Others struggle to stay standing. But they keep working, because outside the tent, a war is still happening, and someone needs to document it. Among them are reporters, cameramen, and photographers. Men whose job is to show the world what is happening inside one of the most inaccessible places on Earth. A few minutes from now, all 6 of them will be dead. An Israeli strike will hit the tent. The attack will instantly become part of a much larger debate. Were these journalists? Were some of them connected to Hamas? Was the strike justified? Or was it something else entirely? The answers depend on who you ask. And that's exactly the problem. Because in Gaza, information has become part of the battlefield. Journalists are accused of spreading propaganda. Governments are accused of controlling narratives. Both sides claim they're telling the truth, and both sides accuse the other of lying. But as the war continues, one fact remains impossible to ignore. More journalists have been killed in this conflict than in any other major war of the 21st century. And that raises a difficult question. What happens when the people responsible for documenting a war become part of the story itself? The tent wasn't much to look at. A few thin sheets of fabric, some plastic chairs, camera equipment stacked in the corner, a temporary shelter surrounded by the ruins of Gaza. But for the journalists inside, it had become both an office and a home. For months, many reporters in Gaza had been forced to work under conditions that would be unimaginable almost anywhere else. Newsrooms had been damaged. Internet access was unreliable. Electricity could disappear for days. Finding food was difficult. Finding safety was often impossible. Yet every morning, they continued reporting. Every explosion, every evacuation, every airstrike, every story. Among the 6 men inside the tent were reporters, cameramen, and photographers. People who had spent the entire day documenting events on the ground. Like thousands of journalists before them, they faced a choice every day: leave or keep reporting. Many had already left Gaza. Others couldn't. And some refused. Not because they believed they were safe, but because they believed somebody needed to remain. Somebody needed to record what was happening. As night approached, the men tried to rest. The day's work was finally ending. For a brief moment, the war felt distant. Then, it happened. A strike hit the tent. The explosion tore through the structure instantly. The 6 journalists were killed. Several others nearby were injured. Within hours, images of the aftermath spread across social media and international news outlets. But almost immediately, another battle began. Not a military battle, an information battle. The Israeli military stated that one of the journalists was connected to Hamas. Journalist organizations rejected the accusation. Questions spread faster than answers. And before the world could fully understand what had happened inside that tent, the story had already become part of something much larger. A conflict over information itself. Most wars are difficult to understand. This one is unusually difficult to see. When the conflict began, journalists from around the world rushed to cover it. Major television networks, international newspapers, independent reporters. Everyone wanted access to Gaza, but very few were able to get it. Since the start of the war, foreign journalists have had extremely limited access to the territory. Some entered alongside the Israeli military as embedded reporters. Others were denied entry altogether. As a result, much of the world's understanding of the war began to depend on a much smaller group of people. Palestinian journalists already inside Gaza. Suddenly, they became the eyes and ears of the outside world. If a building was destroyed, they filmed it. If civilians were displaced, they documented it. If fighting broke out, they were often among the first to arrive. But reporting from Gaza came with enormous challenges. Electricity was scarce. Internet connections regularly failed. Equipment was difficult to replace, and moving from one location to another often carried serious risks. Some journalists began charging cameras and laptops inside hospitals because generators there were among the few remaining sources of power. Others worked from temporary shelters, schools, or tents. Every day became a struggle between survival and reporting. Yet despite those obstacles, information continued flowing out of Gaza. Videos, photographs, interviews, Eyewitness accounts. For many people around the world, these journalists became the primary source of information about the war. But that created another problem. If most information comes from a small number of people working under extreme conditions, how do you verify what is true? And if those journalists are injured, detained, discredited, or killed, what happens to the flow of information itself? Because in modern warfare, controlling territory is important, but controlling the narrative may be just as important. And that raises a question worth thinking about. When access to a war zone is limited, who do you trust to tell you what's really happening on the ground? If you could only receive information from one source during a war, the government, local journalists, or independent observers, which would you trust the most, and why? As the war continued, reporting from Gaza became increasingly difficult. Not because journalists stopped working, but because many of the places they depended on were slowly disappearing. Newsrooms were damaged, broadcast stations stopped operating, internet connections failed without warning, entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. For journalists trying to document events, even basic tasks became major challenges. Charging a camera battery could take hours. Uploading a video might require traveling across the city in search of a functioning internet connection. Sometimes the connection disappeared before the upload finished. Then the process had to begin again. Many reporters found themselves working from hospitals, not because they were covering medical stories, but because hospitals often had generators, one of the few remaining sources of electricity. In some cases, journalists slept near emergency rooms, charging equipment beside doctors treating the wounded. The line between workplace and shelter slowly disappeared. At the same time, media organizations began losing offices. Several buildings that had previously housed journalists were damaged or destroyed during the fighting. Some news agencies relocated multiple times. Others abandoned permanent offices altogether. Instead, reporters worked from temporary shelters, tents, schools, and crowded apartments. Every move brought new uncertainty. Would the internet work? Would there be electricity? Would it still be safe tomorrow? For many journalists, the challenge wasn't simply reporting the news. It was surviving long enough to keep reporting it. And yet, despite those conditions, information continued reaching the outside world. Images of destroyed neighborhoods, interviews with civilians, videos recorded moments after airstrikes, footage that shaped how millions of people understood the conflict. But the more important these journalists became, the more controversial they became. Supporters saw them as essential witnesses. Critics accused them of bias. Some argued they were documenting reality. Others claimed they were helping shape a narrative. In a war where every image can influence public opinion, even a camera can become controversial. And that created an uncomfortable reality. The journalists reporting on the conflict were no longer just observers. They had become part of the story themselves. And for some of them, the pressure was only beginning. Because beyond the dangers of war, another threat was emerging. One that couldn't always be seen on camera. Phone calls, warnings, detentions, and allegations that some journalists were being targeted long before they were ever hit by a strike. So before asking why so many journalists died in Gaza, there's another question we need to answer first. What was happening to the ones who were still alive? For many journalists in Gaza, the danger didn't always begin with an airstrike. Sometimes it began with a phone call, a warning, a message, or a knock at the door. One journalist recalled receiving a call that appeared to come from someone claiming to represent the Israeli military. The message was simple: leave immediately or risk your life. The warning wasn't unusual by itself. Evacuation notices had become common during the war. But according to the journalist, something felt different. The call appeared to be directed specifically at her family. Not the building, not the neighborhood, her. Other journalists reported similar experiences. Some described receiving phone calls. Others reported text messages. Several claimed they were warned that continuing to report could put them in danger. The Israeli military denies these allegations, calling such claims false and unfounded. But whether the warnings were real, misunderstood, or something else entirely, they created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Because when a journalist receives a message like that, a difficult question immediately follows. Was it a safety warning, or was it a threat? And in a war zone, the difference matters. The pressure didn't stop there. Over time, reports began emerging about journalists being detained. Some were arrested at checkpoints. Others disappeared into detention facilities for months. In certain cases, they were reportedly held without formal charges. Human rights organizations argued that these detentions raised serious concerns about press freedom. Israeli authorities responded that individuals were detained only when there were suspicions of involvement in unlawful or militant activities. The disagreement became part of a much larger debate. Were these security measures or attempts to silence reporting? The answer depended heavily on who was telling the story, and that uncertainty became a recurring theme throughout the conflict. Because even when journalists weren't being detained, many described living under constant psychological pressure. Every phone call felt important. Every message felt suspicious. Every new assignment carried unknown risks. Some stopped telling their families where they were going. Others slept with their equipment packed and ready, in case they needed to leave immediately. The war had turned reporting into something closer to survival. And yet most continued working, not because they felt safe, but because they believed somebody had to document what was happening. At the same time, another battle was beginning to emerge, one fought online rather than on the ground. A battle over credibility, authenticity, and trust. Because even when journalists managed to publish their work, a new question appeared almost immediately. Could their reporting be believed? Or were they becoming targets of a completely different kind of attack, one designed not to silence them, but to make sure nobody trusted them in the first place? As the war continued, the battle over information expanded far beyond Gaza. It spread across social media, news platforms, fact-checking organizations, and millions of screens around the world. Almost every major image coming out of Gaza was scrutinized, analyzed frame by frame, questioned, debated, sometimes within minutes of being published. Palestinian journalists frequently found themselves facing accusations that their footage was staged or manipulated. A video showing injured civilians might be labeled fake. A photograph could be accused of being part of a coordinated propaganda campaign. Even images published by major international news agencies were sometimes challenged online. Supporters of these accusations argued that misinformation is common during wartime and that all evidence should be examined carefully. Critics argued something else. They believed some of these accusations were designed not to verify information, but to undermine trust in the people reporting it. Because once a journalist loses credibility, their reporting becomes easier to dismiss. And in a conflict where public opinion matters, credibility can be almost as valuable as territory. The result was a strange situation. Journalists weren't only fighting to gather information, they were also fighting to defend it. Every video required verification. Every photograph required explanation. Every report faced immediate scrutiny. And as trust continued to erode, a deeper question emerged. If every image is called propaganda, and every witness is accused of bias, how does anyone know what to believe? Because in modern conflicts, information isn't just used to describe the battlefield. It becomes part of the battlefield itself. And nowhere was that more visible than in the story of one journalist whose name would eventually become known around the world. Anas al-Sharif. Anas al-Sharif grew up in Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp. Long before he became a journalist, he was simply another child growing up in a place shaped by conflict. As a teenager, he watched reporters document wars, airstrikes, and political unrest around him. Years later, he would become one of those reporters himself. By the time the war began in 2023, al-Sharif was reporting almost daily from Gaza. His broadcasts reached millions of viewers. For many people outside the region, he became one of the most recognizable voices covering the conflict. Supporters viewed him as a journalist risking his life to show the world what was happening. Critics pointed to old social media posts and accused him of sympathizing with Hamas. The Israeli military went further, alleging that he was connected to the organization. Al-Sharif denied those accusations. His employer rejected them. Several international journalism organizations also challenged the claims. As with so many parts of this war, competing narratives emerged almost immediately. And for many observers, determining where journalism ended and politics began became increasingly difficult. Then came August 2025. Al-Sharif was inside a tent near a hospital alongside several other journalists. The same tent we saw at the beginning of this story. An Israeli strike hit the area. Al-Sharif and 5 other media workers were killed. The Israeli military later stated that al-Sharif was a legitimate target because of alleged links to Hamas. Journalist organizations, human rights groups, and media outlets disputed that conclusion. The debate continues today. But regardless of which interpretation proves correct, one fact remains undeniable. 6 journalists lost their lives that night, and their deaths became part of a much larger question about war, information, and truth. Because conflicts are fought with weapons, but they are also fought with stories. Every government wants support. Every armed group wants legitimacy. Every side wants its version of events to prevail. And that is why journalists matter. Not because they are always right, not because they are free from bias, but because without people documenting events on the ground, the world sees less, knows less, and understands less. In the end, courts, investigators, and historians will continue debating what happened in Gaza. But if journalists disappear, those debates become much harder to resolve. Because when witnesses are silenced, certainty disappears with them. And in wars like this, the first casualty isn't always the truth. Sometimes it's the people trying to find it.